Hello, everybody. So today we're going to talk about sleep paralysis, which is quite an interesting altered state of consciousness that is surprisingly common. But before we do that, the Qualia of the day is this particular type of pasta that is called Gigli. It's also called Campanelle, I believe. And it's quite interesting. I mean, it's kind of this cone shaped together with rigged edges. And um, it is actually literally, from a geometric point of view, a hyperbolic pasta. And the thing is that, hyperbolic pasta in some sense is going to be maximizing surface area um, relative to the overall volume of it. And, one of the fascinating things about it is that the type of surface area that you have in your pasta will determine, how much sauce each bite contains. So I think this is definitely moving in, this, in the optimization gradient towards, pasta that maximally holds as much sauce as possible, which I think it's a, fascinating topic. And of course, cultural evolution would suggest that the, popular pastas probably have some interesting culinary properties just based on their shape. Although I suspect that, yeah, designing it mathematically or with a, evolutionary algorithm or with deep learning, we can probably find completely new versions of pasta that actually maximize a particular variable, like how many chunks of tomato you can fit in it probabilistically. All right, so that's enough about hyperbolic pasta. Let's move on to the topic of the day, which is sleep paralysis. So for those of you who haven't experienced it, it's one of those relatively common things. I believe about like 1 in 20 people experience them on a recurring basis, and about like 1 in 5 people have experienced them or experienced them in their life. And probably the number might be higher. It's just that you don't always remember them, or you may remember them as like a weird dream or a nightmare without like necessarily remembering the phenomenology that would indicate it was actually a sleep paralysis. But it's defining features and characteristics is like the feeling of being stuck in your bed, usually hallucinating in one way or another, feeling weird vibrations, pressure in your chest, oftentimes a kind of a negative vibe to it, and you can't wake up. It's kind of like this twilight place, and neurologically it has something to do with the chemicals that keep your body immobilized while you are dreaming are still on, while at the same time your brain has reached the arousal level of wakefulness, so you're really paralyzed. That's why it's called sleep paralysis. And I have quite a bit of experience with it. I was trying to do a Fermi estimate of how many times I've experienced sleep paralysis, and I'm coming to a number that is probably between 100 and 200. And it's gonna sound strange, but I'm probably one of those cases where sleep paralysis has actually benefited my life, because it's roughly in the window of time, number of times where it's not common enough to actually be a problem and make me dread go to sleep. But it's also not rare enough that I've only glimpsed this state. I've had enough experiences, and especially enough like lucid sleep paralysis, where I've been able to investigate the subjective qualities of it. And in that sense, I actually oddly feel grateful about the fact that I've had a good number of sleep paralysis. And it probably peaked at around like the age of 22 or something like that, and it's been declining since then. But I think at the peak it was about like pretty reliably like twice per month. Now it's probably more in the once every month or once every 6 weeks range. It still happens, but it's not that rare. And I guess I should mention what are things that increase the probability of it. And definitely when you're like sleep deprived, when you're like very tired, caffeine naps. That's one of the reasons why I don't do caffeine naps, which is like you drink a cup of coffee and you immediately go to sleep. Which is a great, kind of like a 20-minute power nap. The problem, for me at least, is that if I don't wake up, then it's very likely I'll enter into a unpleasant sleep paralysis, especially because it's, a caffeinated sleep paralysis is not that great. Sleeping on your back as opposed to on your side or in any other position, that also increases the chances. In my experience, particular substances. Like there's this nootropic, quote unquote nootropic supplement called niacinamide. It's connected to NAD plus, which is something I've talked about before about it's just in relation to its usefulness for benzo withdrawal, as well as like as an anti-aging supplement. But niacinamide is really just kind of like a pretty mild, relaxing agent that helps some people go to sleep with relatively few side effects. Also, it helps, coming down from a rough like LSD trip or something like that in the 60s. They used to give niacinamide to patients actually undergoing psychedelic therapy. If they had a difficult time, they just wanted to go to sleep and they didn't want to use something stronger, they would use niacinamide. Anyway, that is a risk factor, so to speak, for me to experiencing a sleep paralysis, which is why I don't take it on a regular basis. And I'm sure there's like other things that also increase the probability of it, but that's what I could remember in passing. Okay, so let's get on to specific weird experiences, because I wouldn't say there's only a sleep paralysis state. It's more kind of like a cluster or like family of states, and in some senses, some of the weirder states that people who live in the straight and narrow, who don't are drug naive or meditation naive, they're likely to experience sleep paralysis as kind of like an outlier of like particularly odd state. And I'll just mention a few weird things that I have experienced in sleep paralysis. First of all, modality swap, like trust in modality swap. Well, I've mentioned this anecdote before, but basically what happened was I once woke up and my visual field was stuck. And it was essentially just looking at a weird green image that I couldn't really make out. I didn't know what it was, but it was kind of like stuck. It was more the low-level features. I mean, kind of the light sensations and the colors, the texture, but not the objects in the scene. I couldn't tell that. At the same time, my touch was completely functional. I could like walk and move around in my room, and I even went to the bathroom and I opened the faucet and like washed my hands, and like I felt the water in my hands, and it was super disconcerting to have like this visual field that refuses to update. So that probably wasn't that long, maybe like 40 seconds or 1 minute, like standing up from my bed and going to the bathroom. And then all of a sudden I realized that, hey, I could move my visual field by moving my head. And I realized that I was actually in my bed. And that what was going on was that I had been experiencing a sleep paralysis, but it was one where the visual input from my eyes was actually going into my sleep paralysis state, whereas my tactile experience was completely hallucinated. So it's very weird. I had trusted my visual field. I had trusted my tactile experiences and mistrusted my visual field, and I should have done the opposite. And of course, this has like a lot of works as a metaphor for other things in life as well, right? Like where we actually mistrust the one that we should trust, and vice versa, and that creates a completely different worldview as a consequence. So that's a really weird one. Another one that happened was like, I think in college at some point, I was recovering from a cold. I had arrived back to university, to my dorm, and I remember taking, I think, like a Dayquil, which is active constituents include like DXM and phenylephrine and guaifenesin, two of which are psychoactives, which are like DXM and guaifenesin. No, and phenylephrine. Phenylephrine is like a mild stimulant, and DXM is like a dissociative. And like, in high doses, DXM is a otherworldly, extremely bizarre state of consciousness. Way more strange than sleep paralysis by a long shot, and also probably way more significant from the point of view of consciousness research. But, in tiny doses, it's used as a anti-tussive against, coughing. And, I was like taking that for a legitimate purpose, kind of relieving cold symptoms and just, passing out. And I don't know why they mix exactly those things, but I remember that I was kind of like overstimulated in my sleep because of the phenylephrine, and also slightly and weirdly dissociated. But basically, that ended up creating a very strange effect where parts of my visual field corresponded with real world, or like the stimulation from outside, and parts of my visual field corresponded to dream scenes. And that was only in my visual field. That also happened in my tactile experience. So basically, I had a weird and chaotic intermingling between actual sensations from the outside and hallucinated sensations. So it was kind of the experience I just said before, you know, like where some aspects of your experience are hallucinated and some are like actually from the input from outside. But rather than being like segregated by modality, in this case it was chaotic, and it was like patches of each of the different modalities, which, yeah, I'd imagine there was some kind of toggling for sensory gating in my nervous system, you know, catalyzed by the combination of sleep deprivation, recovering from a cold, DXM, phenylephrine, and going to sleep. And like that generated that. And, you know, it's never happened before. At the time, it was really weird. And I even thought, like, I don't know, I'm having a stroke or something. Like, you know, I woke up, I was perfectly fine afterwards. But that was a super strange sleep paralysis. Another thing to mention is kind of the depth of recursion, because there's a lot of reports, and I've experienced these, which is like sleep paralysis are intimately related with lucid dreaming, in that you can go on into kind of these recursive attempts of escaping. You escape your sleep paralysis only to realize that the place you woke up into is another version of your sleep paralysis. And, you know, I've had this go on for like up to like 5 levels. And it's really frustrating when it happens. It's like, no, you're ready to go, ready to get out of the bed. And like, no, you're still in a sleep paralysis. It's just part of your sensation started to become dreamlike. Yeah, so I guess like usually sleep paralysis have this tendency of basically mixing sleep paralysis, you know, qualia with like dreaming qualia. You can kind of go off on tangents and start dreaming. The previous experience that I was talking about was like stranger still, because it was sleep paralysis mixed in with like outer stimuli in this chaotic way. But yeah, no, usually sleep paralysis blends dream and actual sensory stimulation from the outside, usually in unpredictable ways. And I guess what I wanted to say is that, you know, depth of recursion in sleep paralysis and lucid dreams is what I might call like narrative depth of recursion. Because there's something else, and it's important to distinguish, especially to not devalue. I mean, like something like DMT has a profound depth of recursion, but that's like instantaneous in the moment. I mean, this is also the difference between time loops in the sense of the phenomenal time of your current experience is implementing a time loop, which feels that you experience the entire time loop at once and you're stuck. I mean, that's a very exotic and strange state, as opposed to believing that you're repeating, you know, what you're experiencing over and over, but in each of those moments of experience, you don't feel the loop all at once. I mean, like that's a different thing. It's kind of a conceptual recursion as opposed to like lived, realized and rendered, you know, depth of recursion and fractality. And sleep paralysis are like much more in the narrative end. They're not going to generate like these crazy DMT recursive visuals. Like, no, that's not exactly, you know. And for those who say that, you know, DMT is related to dreaming, I mean, the connection is very tenuous. Honest, I mean, it's different temperature parameter, different, you know, Qualia semantic primitives, different valences. The similarities only there insofar as, you know, they're just different and exotic. So yeah, anyway, I would take with a grain of salt, expecting to take DMT and then experiencing something like a dreaming state, which, yeah, that's not going to happen. On the other hand, you can specifically simulate some aspects of psychedelics if you basically believe that you took a psychedelic in a dream, but it doesn't replicate it fully, and it doesn't get to the same level of depth of recursion as actual psychedelics. Although it can be more trippy than normal or like normal dreams. So yeah, there's a little bit of that, but it's just a hint relative to the real deal of like actually, you know, consuming DMT or something like that. So moving on, like I think like another one, I've experienced this a number of times, which is like radio playing, and there's, you know, this really cool like alternative rock band called Dredge. They have an album called El Cielo, which is an entire album kind of like dedicated to the the dreaming states of consciousness, or like I guess like sleeping states of consciousness, including like deep sleep and things like that. And they have a track about the sleep paralysis, which if you listen to that track and you have never had a sleep paralysis, you had never heard of it, even if you read the lyrics, you will probably not know what he's talking about. But he's like filled with references about like being paralyzed, and one of the lines is like, "I too have heard the radio play," and I totally relate to that experience. That you're like stuck in bed, and you can listen to the most wonderful music, and you ask, "Wait, who turned on the radio?" Or like there's like a march right out, like there's like a demonstration, and they're marching and they're playing music, outside of your window. And of course, all of that is hallucinated. Like none of that is happening, but it's quite fascinating. And I have an article about dream music, and dream music can be fascinating, not only because of its melody, not only because the melody can be very, very elaborate and actually coherent, is more because of the quality of the sound that comes with a special type of valence that is wonderful. I mean, it's kind of like being wrapped up. It's very engrossing. It's kind of being in a cave with a lot of reverb and echo effects. And I came to that conclusion because eventually in some sleep paralysis, I tested whether playing just one pure tone, like not a melody, but just one pure tone, purposefully hallucinating one pure tone, would that be pleasant? And the answer was yes. Very much so. It felt very much like an home, when you're deeply in trance, like a single note can be very enveloping and beautiful and resonant. And that's what I experienced. In any case, what I concluded was that what makes dream music special is not the melody, although that can be interesting. It's the reverb and resonating, enveloping quality of the sound, which is, from the symmetry theory valence point of view and QRI's paradigms, it's because basically the neuroacoustics of your brain is altered in that state. And it's kind of like how when you are high on weed, music can sound much more enveloping and pleasant. Likewise, when you're quote unquote high on a sleep paralysis, hallucinated music has its own special fascinating quality. Okay, another one is powerful vibrations. I've also explored these to some extent, and it seems like it's something that is kind of tricky because if you kindle those vibrations when you're in a sleep paralysis, they can get completely out of control. So what you want to do if you want to quote unquote play with those, study them, is to kind of like concentrate on your body and figure out like where there's like any kind of vibration building up, and just giving it a little bit of energy, but like controlling it from the very start, like rather than just like pumping a lot of energy into it, mental attention, just a little bit, and see if it grows. And if it grows, then try to lessen it. And I have found that with the proper mindset, you can basically keep a vibration at a certain level that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It's actually just like intense, intense, but not overwhelming. And that you can study using that you can study basically the consonance, dissonance, noise properties of these vibrations and how they're associated with valence. It's a very direct way of kind of confirming or testing for yourself, debunking for yourself that consonance and dissonance in the nervous system is what drives, the pleasure and pain that you experience. And that's one of the many things that convinced me ultimately of the symmetry theory of valence, weird vibrations and their structure in sleep paralysis, how that's connected to valence. If they do get overwhelming, that can be very unpleasant. So this is definitely something to be careful with. So I'm not even sure I can really recommend it with a clear conscience, but it's interesting. I don't know. I would like more people to explore that if they're psychologically robust enough for it. Another observation, set of experiences to point to is basically flying. There's many ways of flying in dreams. Classically, what people tend to report is like jumping. Another one, kind of like big jumps. So that's a very common way for people to fly. But also you can fly kind of like swimming. And that's also an extremely common one. as an aside, you can also just float. I mean, one thing that I did once in this lucid dream was to make myself believe that I was filled with helium, that I was made of helium. And lo and behold, I started floating and floated really high. And it was quite amazing. And that's something that also that you can use that as a mechanic. Basically, any plausible story, or plausible within the dream logic, can allow you to fly in interesting ways. You know, you discover a new technology, or you put on the Mega Man boots or something. You can also use that. But in the case of sleep paralysis and how that's connected with flying, I think I've actually made a bit of a discovery here, which is, at least in my experience, the most natural, most common way of flying is basically you kind of treat the air as water, or kind of like a viscous medium. Now, this comes naturally, and I think it's because the medium actually is kind of viscous in that state, at least how you're phenomenologically rendering it. And I noticed this because the resistance that you feel from your body when you're in sleep paralysis, I think is that. Like, you're trying to move and you feel this resistance. So if the sensory gating is not complete, you will get a residue of that viscous resistance. And I think that residue of viscous resistance basically feeds onto the content of your dream. So then you actually have a kind of like viscous air to play with. And one of the things that I have found is that basically your brain seeks some kind of like physical consistency. So that if you're pushing against the air, and it is pushing back against you because, Newton's, third law of, classical mechanics, it's going to accelerate you forward or upward if you're doing it this way. So my interpretation of like why you actually fly so often, in a swimming type of way, is because your brain is seeking consistency, is trying to basically maintain the Newtonian, laws of physics in your world simulation kind of real. That's why you need like excuses. And in this particular case, it's like your brain is faced with the decision of like, do I know how to fly? Can humans fly? Or Newton's laws are false. And I think this is way worse. Like, this is like violating something deeper about how the brain, organizes and renders perception than whether humans can fly or not. So, kind of in this balance of inconsistencies, the brain is like, well, okay, fine, yes, humans can fly, but don't touch Newton's laws. Those those are not to be broken. Oh yeah, I guess just to kind of like wrapping up here. I also, it's also true, I think, like when you're like really exhausted, especially if you've been doing like a project, there was a deadline, you push yourself really hard. That's also when I experienced sleep paralysis, or much higher chance. Okay, so like finally, to conclude, how to get out of sleep paralysis? This is an important question. I have found several methods, and I'm sure if you experience sleep paralysis often, you will probably have stumbled upon some of them. The first one is like sheer will. It sounds, not very helpful, but it's connected, I think, to dopamine to some extent. People who abuse like strong stimulants, they say they experience sleep paralysis for days after. And I think like if you're dopamine deprived, there's something about that makes it harder for you to basically have kind of muscle tone and truly command your muscles. But it's something, it's kind of like you can swim uphill to some extent, and sometimes that might be enough to wake you out of a sleep paralysis. But, if that doesn't work, then, okay, don't keep trying, just move on to a different strategy. Holding your breath. This has worked quite a number of times, and also it's a way of like lessening the vibrations in your body. If they get really intense, it's like hold your breath. And it's going to be difficult and somewhat uncomfortable, but you can trust me that in the end it will be less uncomfortable than like being stuck for 15 minutes in one of those very unpleasant vibrations. Like, that's for sure. So holding your breath is probably a pretty, in my experience, is fairly effective. If there's anybody around you, then like whimpering, I have found that like of all of the, channels of communication that my body contains, speaking is not, it's not very plausible. There's so many things I need to articulate and like muscle tone that like, it's not gonna work. But whimpering, kind of like, oh, oh, oh. That is something you can do. And often it freaks out people who are around. And unfortunately, most people will not recognize that as like a sign of distress. They will think that you're just dreaming or maybe like making fun of them, which has actually happened to me. People, like once, like my partner back in the day, like I think the reaction was like, oh, like poor Andres, like he's just like so cute having a dream or something. Whereas like I was actually crying for help, and I could hear that person, and he's like, I really wanted them to wake me up. It's like, what on earth? Okay, so, but if you pre-arrange it, if you're somebody who has sleep paralysis often, then you can talk in advance with whoever you sleep with or whoever is around, your place, so that if they hear you whimpering, they should try to wake you up, and oftentimes that will work. Finally, the two last strategies that have worked, it's kind of this kindling or like rocking. So like if you're pushing a swing, basically. So I think like oftentimes you can do this with like your toes, for example, that like you've got to find the right frequency where to put like energy on your toes. And at first it's going to be really difficult. It's like pushing upstream or like, lifting weights or whatever. So like at first it's going to be slow, but you keep doing it and you find the rhythm and the energy does build up. And if you stop doing it, it dissipates, which is very frustrating. But if you pay attention and you keep the rhythm, eventually you will notice that yes, you can move your feet, you can move your legs, and then finally you can exit the state and you wake up. So that's one other strategy. And the last one is meditation. Like, definitely if you do loving kindness meditation in the sleep paralysis, it's going to make it less unpleasant. It may not wake you up, And also, I'm not sure if like mindfulness will wake you up, but like noting meditation, like paying super close attention to how sensations arise, how they exist, and how they dissipate, and trying to do it like precisely and at the highest frequency possible will energize you. And like, especially if you do it like pretty quickly, it will energize you and create like kind of this like resonance pattern at like maybe 3 or 4 hertz. And that will stimulate you a bunch and it will wake you up. And if it may even like wake you up and you may not even feel groggy because you've been accumulating this energy over the last several minutes in the process of meditating to get up. Anyway, if you've had experiences with sleep paralysis, anything novel or strange or interesting, or strategies for how to get out of them, yeah, definitely feel free to comment. I'm very curious about other people's experiences. So yeah, well, thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.